When we kick off the build, we are first going to start with the 20 infantry men. These can be built out pretty much the same as the instructions tell us to. We're going to be building this to align with the combat patrol rules, meaning that we're going to have one of each special weapon as well as both types of sergeants. However, we are going to want to stop just before we start building out the arms, guns, and putting the heads on the models, as these are going to be the areas we are going to be converting in order to give our combat patrol a distinct Canadian unique aesthetic. In order to do this, what we are going to want to do is carefully remove the end of the barrel section off of the standard 40k las gun, and then come in and do essentially the same for the 30k version. Except on the 30k version, we're going to be removing the barrel just past the power section of the rifle. We may need to, on occasion, go in and clean up a couple of fingers, depending on the hand placement on the 30k kit. Then, using a little bit of plastic glue, we can go in and mount the end of the 30k rifles onto the modern las guns. This gives us a slightly elongated rifle in comparison to the original 40k las gun. Taking our 100% genuine Games Workshop scopes, we can take some super glue and then glue these to the top of the las guns, trying to make sure that the scopes line up nicely with the barrels that we've already glued on. Once that is all done, we do have a final step just to finish off the guns, and this is going to be the addition of some camo or combat tape. To do this, we can take some very thin masking tape. Here I'm using some 1 to 2 millimeter wide masking tape, and we can wrap this around the guns, trying not to cover any of the hands or magazines on any of the models, because that wouldn't make a lot of sense. Once we are going around and doing that, we do want to make sure that we cover some of the scope itself, as well as wrap it around the barrel that we've glued on. This will help to stop any of those areas coming off in the event that we give the model a knock in the future. Finally, we can just run a little bit of thin super glue over all of the tape that we've put down, and what this will do is secure and fix it into place, so we can be 100% certain that it's not going to come off and unravel later on in the life of the model. Before we finish the models though, there is a final area that we need to do for a conversion that is quite key, and that is going to be any of the helmeted heads are going to get a nice conversion to turn our modern helmets into the typical round brimmed hats of the Canadian Mounted Police. To achieve this, we do need to take some thin plastic card and then cut this into rings. These rings can then be used as the brims, and when cut to the right size, we can use a small amount of plastic glue to mount them to the back and the front of the helmet, meaning that we only have a small area to make up due to the fact that heads aren't a perfect circle. These gaps can naturally be filled with things like green stuff, but for speed, what I'm going to do here is take some plastic sludge, which is just sprue melted down in plastic glue, spread that across the gaps just to quickly fill them out, and then later on when it's dry, we can come back and file or sand them so that they're nice and smooth. Given that we're going to be using contrast for a vast majority of the models, we're going to naturally be needing a lighter undercoat. So here we went for a nice zenithal. Then we can jump into the actual painting, and all of the upper armor and all of the clothing are going to get a coat of a bright red contrast. As always, with this being a contrasting method, we want to be careful when we apply it, because we don't want to get any of the red contrast in an area we're going to apply another different color of contrast, because then we will get a distinctive color difference in those areas. So we just need to take our time, work round and apply the neat red coat on top of all of our Canadians. Once all of our mixes are done, we can first take the dark navy, and what we want to do is carefully go round and apply this to all of the trousers and pockets. Doing this in a batch painting method makes this nice and quick. We can go from one model to the next, covering all of the trousers, and by the time we get back to the first model we started with, we can do the same for the boots because the trousers will be mostly dry. There, with the boots, we're going to be taking the dark red-brown mix and again covering over all of the boots, also making sure to catch any undersides of any lifted boots. This means the model's armor is essentially sorted. but we still have a fair few elements remaining, things like the bags, the pouches, and things like that. And there we're going to be using a brown contrast, which will render them essentially neutral in the overall scheme. We then want to take advantage of this brown contrast being out. So what we're going to do is paint the entirety of the gun, the scope, and any metallic metals as a brown contrast layer. These straps and belts are going to be painted in white, just to give us a little bit of separation. And because we've used a zenithal, we can't exactly go straight in with a white contrast. It won't give us the best outcome. So what we're going to actually be doing is starting off by painting in a couple of layers. Starting from a mid skin tone as the base coat, we want to start from here and start to layer up, going into a very light flesh as the second highlight. Then once we've caught nearly all of the areas with this lighter flesh, we can bring up the brightness of it a little bit more by mixing in some off-white into our light flesh in roughly a 50-50 mix. This can then be used for the final edge highlights and also to pick out the most raised areas, which sets the stage perfectly for the final step of applying a white contrast. And what this will do is add back in some of the extra detail as well as a little bit of shading for us. Hopefully all of our metals have already been given a brown base coat. So what we're going to do is utilize this and just give a small amount of metallic shine. And we can achieve this by a simple overbrush using a brass on all of the metal areas. This will give us a nice, really simple edge highlight that also will articulate the metal essence, giving us that nice reflective shine. Then what we can do is tackle the wraps on the actual gun now that the metallics have been painted. And these are going to be painted in a clean coat of whatever color we're going to be using. And as I said, relating possibly to the base. Here we're going to be using green rubble and green plants on the base. So we're opting to give the wrappings a green base coat and layer, which works nicely with the colors of the base. For this really quick black method, what we want to do is work from a black base coat, which is easily achieved. And we're going to go around and do a nice array of both broad highlights as well as sharp edge highlights. And we're going to be using a light flesh. This should help to build out some wear and tear along the hat and some of the softer edges. And that's what we'll do with the broad highlights. Whereas we will then be defining the clear shape of the hat using some broader, stronger edge highlights. Once all of these highlights of all of the types are dry, we can come in and give the area a black wash. What this will do is darken down the last stages as well as desaturating the warmth from the skin tone, giving us a really nice quick black hat, which means that we can then move on to the final things like the face mask, which can either be in our, I would say, base coat color of whatever our bases are, so in my case green, or as we're doing here, we're going to be painting them also in black. And that gives us 20 painted infantry for our combat patrol. And these guys are really nice and easy to achieve. We've just done essentially contrast layers, and it means that we can then go back later on once the rest of the builds are done and then build out some highlights just to push the tabletop quality a little bit more. And that essentially brings up to the point that our current troops are, and conveniently most of this unit are actually veterans, so we're going to be painting them at least to this standard, and then we're going to be pushing them a little bit further through the use of some additional highlights and things like that on top of our contrast layers. Naturally, we could do this for all of our troops, but at bare minimum, it's nice to put a little bit more effort into our command squad, and this will also show them up a little bit more on the field. Let's then start off with the reds, and here we can do a simple round of highlighting, and we want to be using a bright red. But we do want this bright red to naturally be brighter than our original contrast layer, and then this will build out those brighter highlight sections. Essentially, we're going to be using the contrast layer as a sort of guide and a map. By working with the contrast and the zenithal layers, we can quickly build up a nice transition from a darker recess red to the new bright surface red. Then we can work on the trousers. This is just going to be simple edge highlighting, and we're going to want to use a dark to mid navy blue, which will nicely complement the undercoated and base coated trousers, and we want to catch all of the most raised and sharp edges. Then we're going to be doing essentially the same thing yet again, but this time with the boots. Where these are a darkish red, we want to come in with a dark reddish flesh tone for all of the highlights in this area. As before, with both of these colours, we will want to do some highlighting. The browns, we are just going to go around and do a plain edge highlight on all of the bags and the pouches, while the metals will be getting a narrow panel as well as an edge highlight, just to give them a nice pop of shine. I'm not going to be touching any of the green that we used in our variable colour schemes based on our basing, because I expect that would be changed depending on where your models are based and what environment they're in. But if you are, for example, using green, we also picked up any of the accessories. So we picked up things like the wraps, the grenades, and the scope lenses in this green. This then leaves us with all of the blacks. And here we have the hat and some other areas like neck armor. First, we're going to be starting off from a black base coat, either from a black undercoat or a black Legion application of a contrast. Then we can do some broad stroking highlights and narrow edge highlights using a light flesh. Once that flesh is dry, we can then slap a black wash over all of the areas which we want in this dark black greyish tone. And what that will do is darken down and desaturate the flesh that we've applied into a nice grey highlight. Now that is essentially the entourage for our commanders done. These guys got painted the same as our normal folks, but they did get those additional highlights, which in theory we could apply to all of our troops if we wanted to paint them to this same standard. That does leave us with our actual commander though, and we tackled that slightly differently. What we're going to be doing and going through is swapping around the colours and the areas. So what was a predominantly red jacket is now going to be white. So the predominant surface area and main colour of the model is white instead of red. And this is one of the reasons that we actually chose to go with black as the colour of our hat. Kicking it off, we can start with the whites, and this is going to be one of the few areas that we do not use contrast as a base coat. What we want to do is start from our typical zenithal or white base coat, and then lay down a medium to warm flesh tone. This may take a couple of coats to get a nice smooth base coat, but once we've worked around and applied this over everything, we can start to blend up in brightness. We're going to start by mixing in some of the light flesh into our mid flesh. Mixing this up to a rough 50-50 mix, we can do some broad highlights, catching most of, or if not all of, the cloth. We really just want to be leaving the slightest hint of warm flesh in the recesses. Once this is done and dry, we can go round with just the light flesh and essentially highlight all of the sections and largest panels that we want to be bright. We can take this bottle of off-white and then mix it into our light flesh in order to do some final sharp highlights. We'll be aiming to catch the most prominent and raised areas of the cloak or fabric that we're highlighting. We then have the option to stop here. If we've done some careful blending, it might be good enough and we might like it so that we can stop at this point. But otherwise, we're going to go in and add a little bit of contrast in order to bring back some of the sculpted details. Thinning down this contrast slightly will ensure that it doesn't pull too much on the surface, so we can apply this across all of the white areas. While it dries, we do want to keep an eye on it, and if there are any areas with a little bit too much pooling, within the first 30 to 60 seconds, we can go in and mop this away. Once it is fully dry, we can do a nice round of highlights just to bring back that crispness of the white. And here we're going to be starting off with our mix of light flesh and off-white. This will be used to pick out the main surface areas that would get hit with the most amount of light. We can also use this to clean up any areas that are overly stained with our contrast. Once this is done, we can then take the off-white as it comes, watered down slightly, and then apply some pure narrow off-white highlights, catching all of the brightest surfaces and sharpest edges. We could do this at the same time as painting the whites, but for the video we've separated it for ease. And here, once we've applied the warm flesh, we want to come in and apply a nicer, broader highlight using our light flesh. This will catch all of the raised areas, things like the brows, the cheeks, and the nose, and for things like the knuckles and hands on those areas that are not the face. This can then all be slapped over with a flesh wash. What this should do is pick out all of the sculpted details while adding back in that general warmth that we expect to see in skin. When doing this, we decided to make life difficult by making the bulk of the banner white, and then red being the secondary colour, a bit like we did with our commander. This means that we will be using naturally the same method for the white flag or banner as we did for the robes on our commander, layering up through a warm flesh, through to a light flesh, and then an off-white, slapping down a thinned down layer of contrast before doing our final round of highlights. All of the boundaries and surrounds on the banner are going to be done in red, painted in the same way as the armors with a red contrast and a red highlight. The central logo is going to actually be a bronze, so we naturally need to start off with our brown base coat and then a bronze highlight. So we naturally have the inverted scheme for our commander, and I think I'm going to keep that going in regards to the higher the ranks, the more white is going to be on the models where it's suitable to put it on, essentially. The only thing I'm now considering is a commissar. Should a commissar still be black, or should we be putting a commissar entirely in white and having their differentiating feature be a white hat as well as white robes or armor? Let me know what you think. I'd be awfully concerned and interested to find out what you think would be the best route for that. And obviously now, if you're at this point in the video, you are, I believe, invested and you quite like what we're doing, and you might not have seen, or hopefully should have seen, the video where we convert up these original guys for the video, where we did all of the tweaks from the various kits and the combat patrol to make our unique star teams. We will naturally then be starting off with the metals, and similar to the metals across the entire army that we've done so far, we are going to be starting off with a dark brown contrast on all of the areas that we want to be our metallics. Given this is a contrast, we can be relatively confident that it's going to easily flow into all of the recesses on the models and give us a nice base coat to work from. Then what we can do is go out and dig a dark bronze or dark gold from our selection of paints, and we're going to use this in an overbrush fashion across all of the metal areas. This is very similar to dry brushing, but we're going to be depositing a greater amount of paint, giving a cleaner metallic section, but leaving the brown contrast in the recesses. Taking our brighter, punchier gold, what we want to do is dry brush this across all of our metal areas once our overbrush is dry. We do want to be relatively heavy in order to brighten up the whole area. What we want to do is try and make a decent amount of difference across the uppermost, brightest areas, and we should be able to see that in this variation between the undry brushed and post dry brushed models. However, you might be noticing that this is a little bit bright when put up against our troops, and we're going to be fixing that. What we're going to do is darken it down slightly as well as matte it out by using a flesh wash. We're going to want to build some nuance within the metals, and to create this we're going to want to wait for the wash to dry fully, and then we're going to make up a mix of the two metal colours we've used so far. This mix is going to be dry brushed in a relatively heavy fashion over all of the metal areas. We want to try and make sure that we're applying enough passes in order to pick out the brightest edges as well as the main upward facing flat panels, while leaving the majority of the metal surface in that washed metal state. Then what we're going to do is take the brightest gold that we used in the process and very lightly dry brush this over all of the metallic areas. What this will do is help to pick out the very edges of the metal and give us a nice pop of colour and a pop of shine, which doesn't look out of place thanks to the various layers and build up that we've done so far. If we've been a little bit heavy-handed with previous steps, we can go in with a light pale dry brush to clean up any of the white areas prior to applying contrast. But assuming that's all done and everything is nice and ready for contrast application, we can apply the dark red over all of the areas that we want to be in our red armored color. So on the mortars, this is the armor plates, while the Sentinel is going to be getting a large amount of coverage in this red. Once that contrast layer is dry, what we want to do is take a bottle of light flesh and then carefully dry brush this across all of the areas of red armor. This is going to catch predominantly the edges as well as some of the main upward facing panels and give us a nice edge highlight. This means that we can come in after it's dry with the red contrast that we've used in our original scheme. This brighter red will go all over the armor. Once that is dry, we're going to be finishing up with a combination of edge highlighting, panel highlighting, and a little bit of dry brushing using a very bright red paint. In the first instance, we're going to take all of the silver areas and all of the areas that are going to be black in the rest of the army, so things like the wheels, are getting a black contrast. What this is going to do in regards to the silver is help to reduce any staining of metallics that we've already laid out there, as well as help to bring out the shine of the silver in those later steps. Once the contrast is dry, what we're going to do is take a dark silver and then use this to base coat over all of the metal areas, giving us a nice reflective base coat to work from. Then it's just a simple highlight. We're going to use a mid silver and we're going to highlight all of the upper facing sections and all of the sun facing panels essentially, as well as giving a simple edge highlight to all of those lower facing panels. Then we're going to be finishing it off, and here we want to take a really bright silver and use this to edge highlight all of the upward facing edges, which will give us that nice punch of shine where the color and light will hit the most. That gives us that bright punch of reflection, and the silver is all sorted. This leaves us with only a couple of areas left. Primarily, it's going to be our accessory color that we've stuck across the entire army. And I haven't really touched on this for the simple fact of it's relating to the color of our base. We've gone for green in this case, which ties in with the base nicely. And I will go through how I've done it, but I imagine you're going to change this if you're going to be copying a similar style as this. But essentially what we did was take a dark green as a base coat, apply that all over the areas that we wanted in this color. So we've got things like pipes, details like that, and the computer screen on the mortar. Those are the areas that we've been targeting. Once that base coat's dry, we're just going to be coming in with our lighter green wash, which is going to just add a little bit of tonal difference as well as pick out some details if appropriate, before we finish it off with a lighter green highlight. And personally, I've been using this very old pot of Scorpion Green, but you can swap this out for any other green. I just really like this bright venomous green. At that point, as you can see, we are near enough done. There may be a couple of details that just need to be picked out in a chosen themed color if you have any preferences. But then we can just stick it on a base and we are all good to go. And as you can see from these photos, these were very quick to produce and are at a nice tabletop standard. So it's nice to be able to paint a force quickly and be able to play with a painted force. So that box has been ticked. And as you can see from the rest of the photos, these particular models that we focused on in this video do work nicely with the rest of the models that we've painted in the other videos. And if you have missed those other videos and need to check out how we did it, we have got that here if you are interested. However, if you've already checked that out as you're kind of on the third part of that series, I would suggest checking out the other videos in our Combat Patrol series, which have got different types of videos similar to this, where we tackle a combat patrol in a fun or time-themed manner. So do check that out if you've already seen episode 1 and 2 of this. Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.